All right, Gators, tonight we are here with Will Miles, writer of readandreaction.com, some of my favorite Gator content out there on the web. Okay, you wrote an article this week about something that Billy Napier really seemed to struggle with this year. I want to talk about it and, your thoughts kind of on how we go forward from here, but let's take it back to Saturday night. Do you think that the only way UF was going to win was to be aggressive and maybe take risks? Or do you think that sort of playing conservatively was the smarter way to play it?
Well, I think it's a question of whether he actually did play conservatively because when they had an opportunity there after the safety to try to go for the kill shot, they decided to do that with that double reverse thing that turned into a turned into a intentional grounding penalty and set them back.
Right.
But they had been conservative the whole rest of the game, and that to me is the dichotomy with Billy Napier. Is if you're going to be conservative, then be conservative. If you're going to be aggressive, then be aggressive. But to be aggressive there and not be aggressive when they had 4th and 1 at the 17-yard line with a real opportunity to go up 14 if they make that conversion, get Florida State on their heels. That to me is the dichotomy. Now, analytics wise, you lost about 3.5 percentage points in terms of win percentage when you didn't go for it on 4th and 1 from the 17. But I was there. I saw a lot of open Florida State guys running around and Rodemaker not hitting them there in the first few drives, and he looked rattled, and it looked like hey, we might be able to rely on the defense for the first time all year. So
Right.
I don't hate. Well, analytically, I hate the decision not to go for it on 4th down, but I understand what he was doing. The thing I didn't understand is that he then flipped to be aggressive once he was up 12-0. At that point, pound them, get up 15-0 at the half, get into
Mhm.
halftime with nothing good happening for Florida State, and get off the field. Instead, they run that play specifically. It just blows up in their face. And again, it's not second guessing the play. I'm okay with that play if you've been aggressive the whole game. But because you
Sure.
haven't been aggressive the whole game, it just was sort of the antithesis of what it looked like Napier wanted to do in the game.
Well, and so like you said, we're up 12-0. We just had a really good return. You have the opportunity. I mean, I don't know if you hit three and you're up 15-0, is that a kill shot? I don't know, but it certainly makes it at the very least a 3-score game, right? But what's going through his head right there? Is it the kill shot? I mean, I don't, it does seem the opposite of what Napier generally tries to do. And it truly, Florida had momentum at that point, and I don't know that we ever got it back after that moment.
Well, so yes, he was going for the kill shot. They only had one guy out in the route, so that makes it difficult anyway because they had so many guys flipping the ball around at the backfield. There was
Right.
only Ricky Pearsall out there. If Florida State guards it, the play isn't there anyway. Your quarterback has to be able to throw it away in a way that doesn't turn into intentional grounding. They just couldn't do it because they didn't have enough time. I think the big thing there is that you need to evaluate what your strengths are in that certain circumstance, and the tackles were not Florida's strength in this game. And
Right.
so to do something that's going to put your tackles sort of in a compromising situation when you try to take that shot. Like play action, run a flood. Okay, I'm okay with that. You maybe sneak a tight end out after you've run a flood, so sort of get
Mhm.
everybody moving to the right and then throw back to the left. Like, okay, I can understand doing that. Like you don't have to be ultra conservative, but that was
Sure.
ultra aggressive. And that to me was the dichotomy is, hey, on 4th and 1, we're afraid to put the ball in our quarterback's hands for a QB sneak. We're afraid to turn around and hand the ball to Montreal Johnson or Trevor Etienne. But on 1st and 10 from midfield, we're going to run this really complex play that takes a long time to develop in a game where, they had 1st and goal from the 2 and they dropped back Max Brown. He got hit like immediately. So it wasn't like Florida State wasn't getting to him to start with. They were sort
Sure.
of popping the little, they were popping the runs every once in a while, but some of that was because Florida State safeties were up so tight that if they got any sort of motion, if they got them going in the wrong direction, or if they were able to hit a gap or hit a seam, it turned into a bigger run. It wasn't necessarily because they were doing some great job blocking on the edge.
Do you think that there's a difference between being aggressive and being overcomplicated? Like, was there it just seems like exactly like you're saying, there were opportunities to be less conservative than we're used to Napier being, but not being overcomplicated. I don't even know that I call that play ultra aggressive so much as just complicated.
Well, I mean, so that's true, but I think if it delivers, everybody just lauds him, right?
Sure.
But to me, it's always about process and whether your process is sound. So a couple years ago, or I guess last year against Tennessee, he went for it on every single fourth down, even in his
Mhm.
own territory.
Mhm.
And he went for two when he had an opportunity to on a couple of touchdowns. And after they got the onside kick at the end, they were down five because he'd gone for two a couple of times. But
Sure.
analytics wise, those were all the right moves. Going for it on fourth down when your defense can't stop the opposition, and being ultra aggressive with Anthony Richardson, the way that offense was set up, plus Tennessee's offense with Hendon Hooker, who they weren't stopping all game long. Those were all the right calls to make. He gave Florida a chance to win that game
Sure.
by making those decisions. So he came into this game and said, I'm going to play this one close to the vest. I'm going to play this one conservatively. And you knew that because there were a couple of fourth downs. There was the one on the 4th and 1 from the 17, but they also
Right.
had a 4th and 1 after the ball that fluttered to Trey Wilson, where they were out there and sort of wasted a timeout, and then they punted it. They turned that into a safety, so it's hard to criticize the
Right.
conservatism at that point. But again, even if you run the ball three times from midfield and pin Florida State back inside their own five, you're sort of back in the same situation, up 12-0. I guess I just look at it and say, what was your process coming in? Were you trying to be conservative as a game plan overall? And given what they did in the third quarter, where they didn't let Max Brown throw the ball at all,
Sure.
I think you
We
can
were.
certainly say that that was the game plan. So if the game plan is conservatism, then to turn around and do something that not only is aggressive, but like you said, complicated, I think does sort of raise eyebrows in terms of, hey, we we allowed our emotion to overcome what we thought was the best way to win the game coming in. And that to me is the thing that should disturb Gator fans, is
Mhm.
that allowing the emotion to override plan is bad process. Come in, trust your plan. If the plan doesn't work, now you got to make adjustments from time to time. But the plan was working, like being conservative had them up 12-0. So to then go deviate from that, I think is bad process.
So let's talk for a second, a little bit big picture. Did you notice inconsistencies like the Florida State game in other games this season, or do you feel like he really did kind of stick to his processes outside of this game, and this game was more of an anomaly?
No, I think that there were opportunities for Florida to be aggressive and they didn't take them. I think especially going into halftime, like one of the things that I was critical of for LSU was it was really clear that Florida couldn't stop LSU, and LSU was kind of shooting themselves in the foot. And so
Right.
Florida went into halftime down 17-14, I think, and everybody's like, "Well, it was close. You got to run the clock out there at the end of the first half." But they had 2 minutes to make a drive against an LSU defense that isn't very good. And there again, I think given what you know about your defense, given what you know about their offense, just giving away a possession there is a waste. It's a waste of a possession, and they do that repeatedly, where they get a ball with 2 minutes left, and they even tried to do it in this one, right? I mean, they hand the ball off to Montrell Johnson the first play after they get the ball back after Florida State's first touchdown, run the ball for a couple of yards. The clock, Florida State calls a timeout, then they pop a 50-yard run, and still they run the ball in the next play because I don't think they expected to actually get that 50-yard run. The
Right.
only thing to do there is throw it because you can go for a touchdown. It stops the clock, all those sorts of things. So to me, yes, there's a definite deviation from process. And I think in many ways, an emotional ebb and flow that sort of goes with the flow of the game. And for folks who are heavy into analytics, we tend not to believe in momentum, where you sit there and say momentum is when the guy steps in front of the bad throw and takes it the other way for the touchdown. Like, all that stuff can switch like that, and it doesn't really show up over the long haul. If you stick to your process, you usually end up better off.
Well, and listening to Napier talk, we do tend to think that a lot of these fourth and shorts or field goals or punts or go for it or kick it or whatever, all of these type of decisions are analytics, but it honestly sounds more like Napier's kind of picking and choosing how he feels as opposed to basing it on actual analytics. So is that, I mean, that sounds like that's what you're saying.
Well, so I mean, it depends on the model that you're using, right? I mean, I think, and also who your opponent is. So I
Sure.
would if I were a head coach, I would make different go for it decisions against LSU this year than I
Mhm.
would against Arkansas, because Arkansas has a very different defensive profile or a different offensive profile than Tennessee. So you do need to take your opponent into account. But look, I mean, you could put it into any fourth down calculator that's out there. 4th and 1 from your opponent's 17. When you're at home, you're the underdog, you're favored, or I'm sorry, you're the underdog, but you are ahead by 7. Like, the analytics say it's a 3.5% gain in win percentage by going for it on fourth down there. So you kick the field goal, you get 3 points, everybody feels good, but you just gave your team less of a chance to win the game. And so, he can talk about analytics all he wants, but that one specifically is anti-analytics for just about any model you're going to look at. 4th and 1 in deep in opponent territory. Because look, even if you don't get the first down, it's
Right.
still Florida State's ball inside their own 20. And
Right.
that's the thing that people tend to miss when they go, oh, you risk that on 4th down. Like if you're at your own 20, okay, 4th and 1, I understand you punt the ball. And in fact, there are times when you want to do that. But 4th and 1 inside their 20, even the turnover, quote unquote, is because there's a risk of missing the field goal. There's a risk of a bad snap. And honestly, a 10-0 lead, as we saw, isn't really all that significant. Even if you're going to make the momentum argument, it's not really that significant because they come down, score touchdowns 12-7, and that game felt completely different after they scored that touchdown.
So, how big of a concern is it for you that it does appear like he's not following the analytics. He's not doing what he stands in the press conference and says that he's doing. Do you think it's something that he can or will change?
Well, I think this is why people are calling for an offensive coordinator. Because if you look at the problems for Florida this year, it's really defensive. It's not
Mhm.
offensive
Right.
in terms of what needs to really be fixed. That and special teams. But the call for the offensive coordinator is to enable Napier to be able to make the correct calls when the opportunity arises in these particular situations. So I
Mhm.
think that'll help. I think if they bring in an offensive coordinator, it'll help free him up to make decisions that are not tied into the emotion. Because look, we've all experienced this even when we play Madden, where you're sitting there and you think that 3rd and 2 play is going to get you the first down. You end up a yard short, and then you got to make a decision on 4th down. What do you do? Now, obviously, it's a video game, so we all go for it. But
Right.
the reality is we've all been in that situation, and the emotion plays into it because you're the person who made the call. You're the person whose ego is on the line when the call doesn't work. And I think it helps to separate the emotion from the decision making. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that, and this is the thing that I think Napier is bringing into town better than some of his predecessors, at least if this 2024 class concludes, which is that you look at the great coaches out there, they avoid 1-score games. They don't
Sure.
actually excel in 1-score games. Like Nick Saban's one record in 1-score games isn't much better than Dan Mullen's or Jim McElwain's or Will Muschamp's. The difference is that only about 18 or 19% of his games actually are 1-score games, whereas I think it was McElwain's were like 38% when he was at Florida. And
Interesting.
so there's just a lot less opportunity for screw ups. And
Right.
Saban screwed stuff up. I mean, you think about the kick six, you think about other things like that. Saban's not immune to screwing something up in a 1-score game. I mean,
A decade to avenge that this past weekend.
well, and just this weekend, right? I mean, they're one play away from everybody going, how could you lose to that Auburn team?
Yeah.
It's a 1-score game. It can go either way. And those are sort of coin flips. So the key is you look at a program like Kirby Smart's or a program like Nick Saban's, they play like 1 or 2 of those 1-score games every year. So even if they come out on the bad side of it, they've had a 10-2 year or an 11-1 year, as opposed to if you're already sort of, if you play 5 of them and you end up 1-4 or 2-3, well, all of a sudden you've gotten 3 or 4 losses on your schedule before you've even played the teams that are going to be tough to begin with. So, I mean, in many ways, that's kind of where Napier is. If you looked at each of the games this year, the South Carolina game, they won that one. That was kind of a miracle that they came back and won that one, but still sitting there at 5-2. But then you lose a squeaker to Arkansas. No business that game being close at all. You lose that squeaker to Missouri. Honestly, Missouri's probably feeling that way, that there was no business for that one to be close. But and this one wasn't a 1-score game against Florida State because they put on the touchdown at the end, but it had that feel where it was going to come down to, there was a possibility Florida could have had to come down to a field goal. So to me, that's the key for Napier is the offensive coordinator to avoid the emotion getting into the decision making on the field. And then the second part is just don't have the 1-score games.
We've kind of given him, a little bit of a hard time tonight, but in your mind, what are some of the things that Napier does really well in games that, gives you some hope or some confidence that he is the guy?
So I think you look at his pregame scripts or the opening drive scripts, and you start to see what he's trying to do. So the game against Georgia specifically, where they just made it a drive all about Trey Wilson, they
Mhm.
specifically said we're getting the ball to Trey Wilson, and we don't care what else happens.
Right.
They put him in the backfield. They did some really really inventive things to make sure Wilson was able to get the ball in key situations, and it turns into a touchdown. In fact, many times this year, Florida was up 7-0 after the opening drive. Problem is, many times Florida was either tied 7-7 after the opponent's opening drive or down 7-0 if they kicked the ball off the first time.
Right.
So to me, those opening scripts indicate that it's not an offensive play calling issue, it's a consistency issue, right? That if they have the right people out there and if they can be consistent in terms of what they're doing, and quite honestly, if they can win up front more often than they have in the past, then I
Mhm.
think you're going to see the offense put up points. But again, the offense this year, I don't think was a major problem. They're like 60th in yards per play. You'd like to see them a little bit better than that, but still, considering all the things we thought about the team coming into the year, I think Graham Mertz outperformed what most people thought he would.
Yeah.
He hit, I wrote an article back in March, sort of projecting what his floor and his ceiling was. He hit his ceiling in terms of what I had cited, and so congrats to him. I think he played really well compared to how he did at Wisconsin. And Nate, there's no small part of that is Billy Napier as well. So if you think about his ability to develop at least a pocket quarterback, his ability to get the best out of Graham Mertz, and then his ability to scheme around his players in those opening scripts, I think you look at that and say, okay, if we can get an offensive coordinator in who's taking direction from Napier, because anybody who comes in as an offensive coordinator is going to essentially be running Napier's offense.
Sure.
But if you can get direction from Napier, but then that person maybe has either a better feel for when to call what play, or is just able to separate himself because he doesn't have to worry about the defense, doesn't have to worry about special
Mhm.
teams, doesn't have to worry about, whatever the injury situation and all the other stuff that's going on. I think that'll go a long way towards freeing up those strengths to sort of come to the forefront.
So, some big news, obviously, this week. Corey Raymond and Sean Spencer both let go. What do you think of this decision, and particularly its timing?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. So Napier always talks about relationships, and certainly, I think you're doing the right thing by your recruits, um, allowing them to make decisions on this stuff instead of sort of sniping them with the firings right after they sign on early signing day. Now, do you need to be ruthless when it comes to college football and actually do that and get everybody to sign the letter of intent and then go ahead and make the coaching change? I prefer this just from an integrity perspective, that you want your recruits at Florida who actually want to be there. And I think in the era of the transfer portal, this is probably a good thing to do because anybody who comes there is going to come with the knowledge of, one, you're not going to screw them, and two, that they're not coming in already thinking, well, should I hit the portal?
Right.
And given the number of people we've seen in the portal the last couple of days, I think that makes a difference. So to have this announcement early, to be able to maybe explain to these guys who they're going to be coached by, maybe even get those guys in place before early signing day, maybe ends up being an advantage for some of these guys who weren't not, who might waver otherwise, or at least would be very upset if you fired these guys after early signing day. From the standpoint of just, it's a results business, and the defense has been awful for 2 straight years. So, recruiting honestly is kind of secondary to just getting some production from the guys you've got on there. And it's not something I would normally say, but in this case, like, to be 125th or whatever they are in yards per play is just preposterous for a team that's as talented as Florida is. I know people say they're young, and I know people say that Dan Mullen struggled in recruiting. All those things are true, but they shouldn't be worse than Vanderbilt on the field. And the fact that they're the worst defense in the SEC means that production needs to be a priority in terms of whoever comes in and the people who get shipped out, because it won't matter if they recruit better players because they're not getting production from the guys they've got right now. So to me, the timing makes sense from the standpoint of, I think they had to make a change right away, just given a 5-7 season, all the grumblings that were going on in the fan base, and amongst the boosters as well. But obviously it stinks whenever anybody loses their job. You don't wish that on anybody, but at the same time, I mean, you just look at the stats and go, yeah, I think changes on defense were warranted, and it wasn't going to be the coordinator, so it's going to have to be the assistants.
Do you think that there's more changes coming?
Oh, I definitely think so. I mean, they've got the two offensive line coaches, and they don't have a special teams coach. That has been an area of consternation all year long. The fact that they have the two offensive line coaches allows Napier to be the offensive coordinator. I don't think he can get away with that for another year.
Mhm.
I think the optics of that look so terrible that he's going to have to bring in somebody for offensive coordinator, whether he wants to or not. But honestly, the results on the field should indicate to him that that's an adjustment they need to make. Having a real special teams coach who's responsible for that sort of stuff, I think they'll want to do that too, which
Yeah,
means you got to open up another spot there in the staff. Now, maybe they take somebody who's already on staff and
sure.
designate them the special teams coach, so it's not necessarily a firing. But
Like
look,
if Napier does it himself?
Who does it himself?
I said, what if like Napier does it himself? Like he's no longer the offensive coordinator, but he is the special teams coach.
That'd be an interesting one because the whole argument for the offensive coordinator is that it frees him up to be the
Well,
CEO.
but think about Urban Meyer doing it. And like, when I talked to Urban about being the special teams coordinator, and what he told me was that it allowed him to touch his players every single day, scratch that coaching itch, but it didn't take up enough time that it distracted him from being the leader of the entire team. I think, coaching special teams for a period or two of practice is probably pretty different than coaching the entire offense, the whole practice.
It is. And look, I mean, if they don't have if they believe, so here's what I'll say is that Napier is going to need to win some games next year. And
Mm-hmm.
so he needs to do what he thinks he needs to do to win games. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, if he decides to be his own offensive coordinator next year, I'll sit there and go, I understand it. You're going to ride with what you believe in because you really believe in it. And why make a change if you really believe in it? So again, if he looks at it and says, I need to have that touch, that daily touch with the players, and that means I'm being the special teams coach, that's fine, but it better be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
because if
Which
it's
is
not
hard to be
perfect,
worse.
well, that may be true, but again, I think you know, the 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 thing that I said on Gators Breakdown last night, I think is really the thing that I came away from the Florida State game with is that losing on the road, which is what Florida's done most of the year, it's bad and you don't like it, and losing to your rivals and those sorts of things. But walking out of that stadium with my 8-year-old son, having to hear that infernal war chant, that is such a giant withdrawal on your fan base. And every time there's some ridiculous special teams gaffe, that is a huge withdrawal for your fan base. And the people who are supporting you start going, should I? And the people who don't support you get louder and louder and louder. And we especially see that these days with social media.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to make some deposits. And so, whatever it takes to make those deposits, he's going to have to make because that noise, them doing that stupid chant as they leave the stadium, as I'm leaving the concourse, that's going to stick with me all off season. And it's
Mm-hmm.
going to stick with every fan all off season. And there's some deposits that need to be made. And that means winning some games. And luckily we got the Hurricanes first game of the year next year. So that's a major opportunity to make some deposits. Sounds like A&M is going to be the third game of the year.
Yeah.
Again, an opportunity to make some major deposits. Obviously, an opportunity to stub your toe and fall over too. But no one's getting excited about Samford in that second game. Like you're going to have to start delivering on these big time games and
Mm-hmm.
making those deposits. And whatever it takes to do that, Napier's going to have to figure out. So if that means that everything gets better by him being on special teams, then absolutely. But he's got to do what he believes in because honestly, he doesn't get a fourth year if they're 6-6 next year.
Do you think I'm kind of the mindset that if he hires an offensive coordinator, let's say he hires a special teams coordinator and an offensive coordinator, we already know he's making changes on defense, that sort of restarts the clock a little bit. I'm not saying he's back to year one, but I think you kind of make those deposits, get a little bit of grace from that. Whereas if he doesn't hire an offensive coordinator, I agree with you that I think it's next year or bust. But I do think that there's some grace that could be given if he shows a willingness to change. Do you think it's next year and bust no matter what?
I think the grace will all be dependent on DJ Lagway. I think if DJ Lagway comes in, so you think about Chris Leak
Mm-hmm.
and Ron Zook playing him as a true freshman, he kind of got. I mean, that was back in the days when you didn't fire a guy after 3 years most of the time, but
Mm-hmm.
um, but but Leak, that recruitment, having that hope of a blue chip quarterback sitting there is something that will extend people grace. So let's say Graham Mertz starts the first 4 or 5 games next year. Things aren't going real well. DJ Lagway comes in and just lights things up for the rest of the season. Yeah, okay. Regardless of what the record, I think everybody looks at it and says he just hit on his quarterback. We need to foster this and drive this forward, irrespective of whether there's a new offensive coordinator or not. I think that's sort of the thing. Is that I said this about Dan Mullen, and I think it's true for Billy Napier at this point too, which is that college football is about winning games or selling hope to your fan base.
Mm-hmm.
And so the reason Dan Mullen soured in most people's eyes, and I think there were a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons or the main reason was that when you looked at the recruiting classes that were coming in year after year after year that were the exact same, you went, I don't have hope we're going to catch Alabama. I don't have hope we're going to catch Georgia. It's the same thing. And even if he gets it to like maximum potential, we're going 10-3, and that's not good enough at Florida. So I think you look at Napier and you go, okay, 6-7 and 5-7, obviously not great, but guys like DJ Lagway, that 2024 class, all those guys coming in provide hope for the future. So if you can start showing that hope on the field, then absolutely you get more time to show that development. I think a lot of it comes down to where the 2025 class sits too. So you think about Texas A&M under Jimbo, they had that monster class. I think what was it, 2020, maybe the 2021 class, but everything else was kind of a Dan Mullen class. They're right around 91 in terms of the overall 24/7 ratings. And so I understand why A&M gets rid of him at this point because they're not showing it on the field, and the recruiting has not risen and stayed where that 2021 class stayed. So that to me is going to be the two things for Napier's. What's the 2025 class look like, and then what happens on the field with the quarterback that he's selected as the guy who's going to be the savior. And if it turns out that Lagway is Trevor Lawrence or Deshaun Watson, then he's going to have the same kind of rope that a guy like Dabo Swinney was able to get. It turns out that when you hit on those sorts of guys, I mean, look, Swinney hit on Taj Boyd, and then he hit on Deshaun Watson, and then he hit on Trevor Lawrence. And now we're seeing him. He missed on DJ Uiagalelei, and it looks like he missed on Cade Klubnik. And all of a sudden, Clemson's come way back to the pack. So that makes a huge difference. And if Lagway is anywhere as good as his profile suggests he's going to be, I think Napier will be here for a really long time.
Well, this was fun. We need to do it again. Tell everybody where they can find you on social media and check out all your work.
Yep, you can find me at Will Miles SEC on X, and then you can find me at readandreaction.com. I'm on the Gators Breakdown podcast. We do our own Read and Reaction podcast as well. So, if you go over to Read and Reaction, you should be able to find everything over there.
All right. Well, I appreciate you, and we'll have to do this in a couple more weeks, and hopefully we have some names to discuss.
Awesome. Thanks, Allie.